Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about neurodegenerative diseases. This is a topic that's sort of near and dear to my heart, something that I've spent some time studying, and I think you will find very interesting. And so we'll get right to it. What do we mean when we say that a disease is neurodegenerative? What does that word mean, neurodegenerative? So neurodegeneration is a somewhat complicated way of basically saying that we have injury that's going to continue to occur over some period of time, right? So neuro meaning brain. So really we're talking about diseases of the central nervous system here. And degenerate, so to degenerate means to break down. So neurodegeneration is really a progressive injury that's going to occur over some period of time. Now, there's many complications that come into play when we're talking about neurodegeneration, exactly what it means and how do we study it and how do we cure it. And so one of the problems with neurodegenerative disease is that there's many different parts to neurodegeneration. So neurodegeneration actually occurs in phases, or what I say, multiple facets. So there's typically an early phase, initial onset, where we're starting to get some form of cellular pathology, right? So something's not working right in the cell. And that will continue on until we get to another critical point where maybe we start to get a secondary, second type of injury in a cell or a tissue. And then oftentimes, and well, really every time, it will spread to neighboring tissues. And so it sort of spreads, kind of like a plague, right? And it involves all of the different cell types in the tissue. So when we think about the brain, we think about the neurons, of course, but don't forget about our unsung heroes, the glia. We know the glia are extremely important, vital components of the brain and spinal cord as well, right? And so in addition to their sort of protective function and nurturing function, they also have a reactive capacity as well. And so when there's an injury, one of the things that really is important about the brain is that the glia react to it. Some of the reactions of the glia can be important. We're going to talk about that. And although we've been studying many diseases, so neurodegenerative diseases, we can think of things like Parkinson's disease. So that's one that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about Alzheimer's disease. There's many different types of neurodegenerative diseases. And although they've been studied for many of which have been studied for many, many years, decades, tens of decades, right? We actually still don't really know, really, for sure, exactly what causes most of these neurodegenerative diseases. So this makes it very difficult to treat something if you don't actually know how it's happening. The one thing that we do know about the vast majority of these neurodegenerative diseases is that the one common factor tends to be getting older. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, that's not particularly helpful, right? Because we all know that as we get older, processes start to break down and they don't work right. So that seems like sort of an obvious thing, but that really is the primary link between most of these neurodegenerative diseases, at least at this point in time. Now, as research continues, hopefully we're getting closer and closer to discovering some of the real etiology or some of the causes of some of these diseases. And we're going to talk about some competing theories regarding the cause of a couple of these diseases today, right? But basically, what the primary goal of research is at this point is to try to figure out what we think is causing it and try to develop what we call therapeutics, right? So basically building drugs in a lab. We have a bunch of chemists who sit around and try to make drugs that we think will either cure the disease entirely or most of the time slow the progression of the disease. So how can we provide patients who suffer from these diseases with the best quality of life for the longest period of time possible? All right, because ultimately there really are no cures for any of these diseases up to this point. And so active research continues in this capacity. So although there's many different forms of disease, so for example, Alzheimer's disease is really a disease that has to do with memory and cognitive decline. Sometimes rapid, sometimes not as rapid, it just depends, right? Whereas Parkinson's disease is more of a motor dysfunction that eventually will also spread to cognitive decline, but it's more of a motor dysfunction in the beginning. But even though we could have very different pathology, at least symptomatic pathology, so the symptoms demonstrated by patients, many of the same things happen. And so in virtually every injury, it's not just an injury of the gray matter or the white matter of the brain, it's actually both. So just to take a step back here, we did talk when we talked about neuroanatomy about gray matter. So these are the regions that are called which due to their color, but really which reflect densities of cell bodies of neurons, right? In the gray matter, we have lots of cell bodies, whereas the white matter is mostly axonal tracts, right? So white matter tracts that actually project from one brain region to another. And we talked about how the white matter is important for very fast conduction of electrical current from one place to another, so the neuron can signal to the next neuron that's in many cases in a different brain region, right? But the gray and the white matter are both involved. What we're starting to find out now, and this is something that wasn't really a popular theory, at least when I started doing research, is that it seems like virtually every neurodegenerative disease seems to involve some sort of misfolding of proteins. And so when you learned about proteins, hopefully you should have learned this, that really the reason why proteins act the way that they act is due to their three-dimensional structure. And so once a protein is made, it's made up, yes, of a bunch of amino acids, but ultimately it has to fold into a certain configuration. That configuration is critical to the function of the protein, right? And so what we're finding out is it looks like for just about any disease you can think of, there are proteins that don't appear to be folded correctly, and this can lead to some problems. So here, this is a picture of what we call amyloid plaques and tau tangles. Now we're going to talk about this a little bit later, so we'll leave it on the back burner for now. But this actually does reflect some misfolding of proteins. So these are things that are not supposed to be there. And this has to do with AD pathology, which we'll get to later. And the last component is mitochondrial dysfunction. So you know mitochondria are essentially the power plant of the cell, right? It's where we get most of our power from. And what many people don't know is that we can have damage to mitochondria through things called reactive oxygen species, okay? So reactive oxygen species are basically molecules that are created after an injury, and these molecules will basically tear proteins apart and break apart essential components of a cell. And one of the things that tends to happen is what we call oxidative damage. So this is just sort of like, well, really it's chemistry, but you should have done a little bit on oxidation and reduction reactions when you did general chemistry. And so this is the mechanism by which these reactive oxygen species will attack proteins and parts of cells to break them down, okay? And they actually act on mitochondrial membranes. And this is an important commonality between many different degenerative diseases, and these effects on mitochondria increase with age. So again, the commonality being aging, right? We also have increased mitochondrial dysfunction throughout the aging process. So this is something that has definitely been linked to neurodegenerative diseases. And in addition to normal protein death, so sledgehammer crashes into you, you might have a bunch of torn tissue that gets ripped apart, right? And eventually dies, okay? And this will die through necrotic cell death. We call this necrosis. We also have apoptosis, which is programmed cell death. So this is when cells actually decide, for whatever reason, basically signaling from other cells and molecules, that something has gone wrong and the cells need to undergo essentially cell suicide. Okay, and this is apoptotic cell death. This is apoptosis. So there is actually a lot of apoptosis that accompanies neurodegenerative diseases as well. All right. So let's start off talking about Alzheimer's disease. This is one I think most people know of. At least one person who has Alzheimer's disease. Might be somebody in your family, might be a family member of a friend, right? And Alzheimer's disease, or AD as I call it, it's a very, very common disease. There's a ton of money being spent in this country on care for Alzheimer's patients and also being devoted to research for Alzheimer's disease. So not only is it terribly traumatic disease for someone who suffers from Alzheimer's disease and the families of people who have to learn to deal with and care for those who have Alzheimer's disease, but it's also a tremendous monetary burden to society in terms of healthcare. So this is one that's really been targeted as one of the important ones. Now, we know, particularly with Alzheimer's disease, it's probably better known that it's really a disease of the elderly, right? Although there is early onset Alzheimer's, so you don't have to necessarily be in old age to get Alzheimer's disease, but it is more common. Okay, so the older you get, the more likely you are to develop Alzheimer's disease. And there's actually one form of Alzheimer's that is what we call familial. So that means that it appears to be heritable, right, or passed down. There appears to be a hereditary component to it. Really, the familial Alzheimer's disease, the last figure that I saw, it only really represents about 1% of all Alzheimer's cases. So the vast majority of them are not familial, or at least we don't think at this point that they are. So it does not appear to be primarily a disease that's genetic, okay? So it appears to be through other factors. And so if you know if someone with Alzheimer's disease, you probably know that it sort of starts with inability to remember things that you used to be able to remember. So maybe you forget where you put your keys, or you're having trouble keeping your appointments because you're sort of forgetting which days you're supposed to be doing what, and things of this nature. And then it can actually, and it will, progress into more severe memory impairments. So you've probably heard stories about patients getting lost on their way home. So they may have lived in that house for 15, 20 years, and then one day they just can't remember how to get home and they get lost, right? So this is a very frustrating thing, and it progresses. Like we said, it's progressive injury over time, and so the magnitude of memory dysfunction will become greater, and therefore the quality of life decreases. Very frustrating. There's a lot of disorientation, okay, in patients who are just generally confused. And oftentimes patients will report having good days and bad days, particularly towards the beginning. But eventually, unfortunately, this is going to lead to complete cognitive loss. And what we know about the pathology associated with Alzheimer's disease is a couple of things. Primarily, there is a death of what we call cholinergic neurons. So we know what that means now. These are neurons that make acetylcholine, right, or acetylcholine. And this is an important neurotransmitter in memory function, in addition to many other things, but it tends also to be involved in memory. And in certain regions of the brain that tend to be more affected by Alzheimer's disease, we have loss of cholinergic neurons. And also, quite a bit of protein misfolding. And so, essentially, what we end up with are large regions where we have accumulations of proteins that have been misfolded or folded the wrong way such that they start to form big aggregates together. All right? Now this is what we call amyloid beta plaque, or A beta plaque for short. Okay? And we're going to talk about how this forms. But essentially, A beta plaques represent A beta proteins, individual proteins that are misfolded, and they start to stick together and they form big clumps. Now, when we get these big clumps or these big aggregates of A beta in the brain, they're toxic, okay? And they tend to kill neurons. The other misfolding portion here is this, what we call a tau protein, all right? So the tau proteins accumulate inside the neuron and actually form tangles, right, in the axons of these neurons. And these tangles actually are detrimental to the function of the neurons. The neurons can no longer function correctly. Now, these are two hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease pathology: the presence of A beta plaques and tau tangles, what we call neurofibrillary tangles of tau protein. All right? So these are features that if you were to examine tissue from the brain of a deceased Alzheimer's patient, this is what you would find. You would find a brain that is riddled with A beta plaques and tau tangles, neurofibrillary tangles of tau protein. All right? Now, are these the actual reason, the actual culprit for the progressive cognitive decline? And if so, does one actually cause the other? And so this is essentially a chicken or the egg debate. And depending on which type of researchers you ask, everybody has an opinion about whether they think A beta is primary cause or tau protein or neither. And it just depends.